First up is Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, and I think there are going to be 3 audience segments who are most concerned about whether or not they should see this movie, and I will address 2 of those together and then one group separately. So, to people who are not familiar at all with Dungeons & Dragons, or maybe only know it as a reference through pop culture or the zeitgeist or, Stranger Things or whatever it may be, to you I say, maybe just ignore the fact that it says Dungeons & Dragons on it and go, do I like fantasy movies and do I like comedy movies together? Do I like those 2 things in combination? Then I think you will have a very good time at Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, because that's just what it is. We'll talk about the hardcore stuff in a minute, but I think where it succeeds the most is it's just a band of characters who they establish pretty quickly together. They give us the backstories in one go and, how they all relate to each other. It's got Chris Pine, Michelle Rodriguez, Regé-Jean Page, Justice Smith, Sophia Lillis, Chloe Coleman, Daisy Head, and Hugh Grant, who, again, Chris Pine and Hugh Grant in particular, wasn't exactly expecting them in these roles, but chef's kiss. Great job there. They're perfectly cast. And then I think the other group of people who are going to be seriously invested and stressed out about this, the fact that it says Dungeons & Dragons up front, are tabletop RPG players. And as someone who has, is probably more of the camp of familiar through the cultural zeitgeist, but has played some one-shots, and not for lack of trying to get a regular campaign going. If anyone out there has space in your ongoing campaigns for a new player, please let me know. But to those folks, I say, aside from the, stressors about the Wizards of the Coast stuff and Hasbro and all those things, I think you're going to have a great time at this movie, as long as you like fantasy, comedy, action, adventure, etc. all together. If you were self-serious about this, then I don't know if this is exactly the film for you, but there are plenty of references that definitely plus up the experience. As someone, like I said, who is vaguely, but maybe a little more than the average Joe familiar with it, who doesn't love a good joke at the paladin's expense? That type of stuff is absolutely rooted in there. You can tell that there's a love for it, and it doesn't go so far in that direction that it's inaccessible to broader audiences, but there's a bit of wink, wink, nudge, nudge to people who are hardcore, actual gamers. There are some big set pieces that I was like, oh, this is a very clever way to incorporate, the actual origins of this game. So to all of those audiences, I recommend this movie. I had a really good time at it. I very rarely get to see new releases more than once, but this one I made time to see again. Like I said, the cast is really fun. I think the effects are good. The action doesn't become overwhelming. For me, it jibed with my sense of humor. There are a couple sequences, one in particular, that I laughed so hard at. But if you are not a fan of that part of it and you want your more, straightforward action fantasy movies like a Lord of the Rings, this is not that. This is a bit more Monty Python meets Lord of the Rings. I keep referencing Monty Python, but that it truly you can feel those, influences all over it. But overall, I had a delightful time. I think it's worth seeing. I'm going to give it a 4.3 out of 5. Next up is a film called Tetris, which is about, you guessed it, the origins of Tetris. It stars Taron Egerton, and this was an interesting one for me. So I feel like I learned a lot during it, but I don't know if it was the right vehicle for it. I almost wonder if this would have been better as a documentary the more I think about it. But, you've got Taron Egerton as the man who basically bought some of the rights to Tetris, but, and this is hopefully not a major spoiler, but I learned this during the movie, Tetris originated in the Soviet Union, and there were a lot of complications in terms of who owns it and who has the right to distribute it, and sort of Western Bloc versus the Soviet Union and all this sort of stuff. And I think where the film gets a little bogged down in some of that is it basically tries to turn into a spy thriller at some points, and I think it would have been more interesting focusing on the business side of it. You've got, basically because of the time it's set in 1988, the KGB is involved because of, Soviet Union, like I said. But there are moments where I'm like, oh, I feel like you're maybe trying to be a bit too dramatized or too ambitious for what is actually happening. Now, I say this not knowing, I'm sure the characters at the time felt, when I say characters, it's based on real people, but, the characters that we are seeing felt that sense of intensity and all that stuff. But I don't know if the way that it is done in this movie does it justice. And so what I think may have been a better move is to focus on and maybe this is dorky, but, I think the business side of it is really compelling. And I say this having seen Air, which I'll do a review of next week. But, it's the story of Air Jordan. And I'm like, yeah, this is basically, a movie about contracts. And yet they did it in a very interesting way. And I think Tetris could maybe have taken a page out of their playbook. Now, however, I will say all this, but at the same time, it's still on Apple TV, so if you have Apple TV, I don't think there's a reason necessarily not to watch it, but I'm not running out to be like, oh my God, you have to watch Tetris. I also think they set themselves up in a weird dichotomy because a lot of the storytelling is through, 8-bit gimmicky animations. I'm like, could you not have figured out a way to show us this versus shortcutting? And then you've got the sort of lightheartedness of that compared to this whole oh my God, our lives are at stake scenario. And I don't know if it tonally works across the board, but I see what they were trying to do. I learned some things about video game history. Again, I assumed Tetris was ubiquitous, but now realizing that, oh my God, maybe some of the youth don't know what it is, which is a very scary thing. So please learn what Tetris is. And if it requires you to watch this movie to do so, do so. But overall, I think it's a fine watch. I'm going to give it a 3.8 out of 5. Next up is a film called 1001, and it's from A.V. Rockwell, and this is a really tough one. So it stars Teyana Taylor as a character called Inez, who basically kidnaps 6-year-old Terry from the foster care system, and then they, basically try to make their way in New York City, and Teyana Taylor is so good in this. She gives an excellent performance. I am not familiar with her work prior to this, but I think she gave an absolute powerhouse. And I know that's such a cliche term when it comes to actresses, but I do think, she makes this movie. And I'm sure there will be awards buzz around her. And having seen Everything Everywhere come out early in the year in Coda, you can now carry your way through from an independent film. But that's the business side of it. The challenge of this movie is that it is very heavy and it is very hard to recommend. And it is also less 3-act structure than I think some people get used to, myself included. And it's a more of a ambling slice of life, a long slice of life, but still a slice of life that, because there aren't as many cathartic moments or obvious pathways or resolutions, paired with the fact that it is really heavy material, it can be a harder one to recommend. I think there are also a couple that, I wasn't there at the time, but I feel like it does accurately represent mid-90s, early 2000s, New York culture and culture in general. And as a byproduct of accurately representing that, some of the things in it feel antiquated and therefore even more compounding of the uncomfortableness watching it, which means it's successful in what it's trying to do. But as an audience goer, it's hard to be like, hey, do you want to go be really depressed, but also not necessarily get a resolution to it? I got a movie for you. So I will say to you, anyone listening, hey, if you're considering, if you need to go on an emotional journey, but aren't feeling the need to maybe you want to sit with it and don't want a resolution, then 1001 is the movie for you. I think it's worth seeing for her performance alone, but it is a tough one to, I would say, brace yourself emotionally, be in a good headspace before you see it. But yeah, she is excellent in it. It's an emotionally challenging one to watch, but I think it is well done. I'm going to give it a 3.8 out of 5. The next film I have this week is actually similar in that it's a sort of slice of life, more ambling story, although thankfully it is not nearly as depressing. It's called Rye Lane, and it's more of a romantic comedy type film. It stars Vivian Oparah and David Johnson as two 20-somethings who are, dealing with their breakups in life, etc., and they randomly meet in South London, and then they go on an adventure. Again, smaller slice of life, less amount of time than 1001 covers, but it's basically like an extended meet cute, and this movie is only an hour and 22 minutes, which I think was correct. It was the right amount of time. Any longer, and it would have felt overly drawn out, and any shorter, and I don't know if it would have qualified as a movie. But I think the two of them have a good chemistry together. I don't know if it, and maybe this is the intention behind it, it's not as a smoldering chemistry as you might get in another type of film like this, but I think they are a good dynamic duo on screen. I was not familiar with either of them before. I think I'd seen David Johnson in industry, but I don't think he has a ton of screen credits. But I think similar to 1001, this is also trying to showcase a city and a moment in time. It's a modern moment in time in this case, but I will say at a certain point, I had to ask myself, what percentage of this film is B-roll shots of London? Because it does take a very loving eye to the city itself, but sometimes it feels a tiny bit like filler. And when you're in an hour and 22-minute movie, you have to wonder how much filler can you have? But I still think it is fun. I think they're a good pair together because it is so short and breezy. There's not a reason not to watch it in that sense. I think, if you are watching it for the romance part of it, you probably are going to have wanted a little bit more out of it. Like that was my kind of takeaway from it, but I think it's still cute. So I'm going to give it 3.7 out of 5. And then the last thing I have this week is a new series on Apple TV Plus called The Big Door Prize. And I started watching this and I had to stop because it made me ask myself some introspective questions that I think it's more about the premise of the show made me ask this and maybe not the execution of the show, but I give it credit for, forcing me to turn a mirror onto myself and ask my questions. So the idea behind it is this machine shows up in a small town and it prints out for you your life's potential on a little card, and the way people react to it is, I think, the most fascinating part, right? So some people take it super seriously, some people are upset by what they get, some people disagree with what they get. And I think the question it made me ask myself is, oh my God, what would my life's potential be? Am I living up to it? ? And I think one of the most interesting things about the show, it's kind of like horoscopes in some senses, or prophecies, I guess, where do you become a self-fulfilling prophecy because it has been handed to you? If you never got the card or the prophecy or whatever, would it have panned out the same way anyway? Or is that the sort of inciting incident that sets you on the path? Or because you get this info, does it set you on a different path? All excellent questions. Again, I might be giving the show a little bit more credit than it deserves, or it doesn't explore that exactly, but I still enjoyed it. I think there are a couple points in it where it gets a little bit melodramatic, but overall, I still blazed through it. Like, I watched the first two, again, had to take a pause because I was feeling a little bit down and some other stuff was going on. And again, it was making me think, like, am I reaching that? But then when I picked it up, I blazed through the rest of it. It stars Chris O'Dowd, Gabrielle Dennis, Josh Segarra, Ali Mackey, Damon Gupton, and Crystal R. Fox, and I left it wanting more. It's based on a book, so I can't speak to how accurate an adaptation it is, but it left me going, oh, I'd like to read the book because I am interested in, how it worked as an adaptation. But as far as its shows go, I thought it was enjoyable. I also like it does something that the After Party on Apple TV does, where at a certain point, each episode is sort of dedicated to different characters, but there's a larger interwoven story happening, which is always fun, when you get a couple moments with characters. It's breezy. It's 10 episodes. It flies along. The first 3 drop together. That's The Big Door Prize on Apple TV Plus.